Hey YouTube, what is up? Budsterbrown back with my mega marathon review and ranking of all of the Friday the 13th movies, filmed right here at Crystal Lake. Now, my friends warned me about filming here, but it's so perfect for the subject matter. And besides, Jason Voorhees isn't real anyway. Well, at least I think he's not real. Anyway, let's get right into my mega review of the entire Friday the 13th franchise.
Now, while longtime viewers of the channel might be tempted to believe I'm a bigger fan of the Halloween franchise as I've posted several movie reviews on it in the past, I'm actually more of a Friday the 13th fan. Well, comparatively anyway. I can't say that either of these franchises are even near my top 5, as most of these movies aren't all that great, but when looking at them side to side, I actually like Friday the 13th better. However, this video isn't about a killer wearing a William Shatner mask, rather one of the hockey variety. I'll try to refrain from referencing Halloween too often, but there will be a couple comparisons early on and scattered throughout the review. Now, to be frank, most of these Friday the 13th movies are more or less the same, with only a couple tweaks separating them from being practically the same movie, as they all stick pretty close to the same formula with a couple of outliers that do their own thing. Instead of giving detailed reviews on each of these movies, I'd rather focus on how much they adhere to or stray from the tried and true recipe cooked up by the first two films and how well the formula is executed in each entry. As mentioned, there are a couple movies here that go in a different direction, some being a breath of fresh air, and others making me scratch my head in confusion. When going from movie to movie, I'll try not to spoil future entries. For example, if I'm reviewing part 2, I'll try to avoid talking about parts 3, 4, and so on. However, previous entries to the movie I'm reviewing are fair game, and could be potentially spoiled. I know these movies are all old at this point, but I know some people like the heads up, so just in case, there is your warning. Now, not every movie will be given the same amount of airtime, as while some can be easily summed up in a paragraph or two, others deserve special attention. Lastly, after I review a movie, I'll plug it into my ranking system a la Sonic Adventure 2, with each entry landing a letter grade from A to E. Keep in mind that these ranks are given on an adjusted Friday the 13th scale, as all of these movies are lucky to get a passing grade when compared to the works of truly great films.
At the end of the video, I'll show where each movie ranked as well as the rankings of my favorite Jasons. Without further ado though, let's get into Friday the 13th, 1980.
Ah yes, the one that started them all. And the one that started the one that started them all was actually Halloween 1978. I'm going off of what I've heard, so take this with a grain of salt, but apparently the producer of this movie saw Halloween, thought it was good, and decided he wanted to make a ripoff that could capitalize off of Halloween's success. And it's pretty obvious when looking at the final product. Friday the 13th, 1980 certainly borrows a lot from Halloween, such as a plethora of POV shots, the horny teenagers getting slashed, and a blonde-haired final girl that survives the trauma of all of her compatriots getting capped. That being said, the movie has a fair amount of differences to Halloween. As opposed to the town of Haddonfield, Friday the 13th has Camp Crystal Lake as its setting. And honestly, I think this is genius. Not only is it cheap to film, but it is also a location that most of us has experienced, a campground. Maybe I'm projecting here, but there is genuine built-in fear that comes when hearing a twig snap in the woods, or an unexpected sound that echoes through the forest. Moreover, the camp setting gives a sense of myth and legend to these movies, like hearing a spooky story at a campfire. While later entries expand off of this idea in a more meaningful way, the first movie is the one that started it all and deserves credit for it. Another franchise staple birthed from part 1 is the gory kills, or as Randy would say,
carnage candy.
Friday the 13th is home to some brutal deaths, whether it's the demise of Kevin Bacon or the decapitation of Pamela Voorhees. This movie is violent. Speaking of Pamela, she is the killer in this movie, as opposed to a certain hockey mask wearing maniac that we all know and love. Apparently, this lady's son drowned in Crystal Lake because the camp counselors were too busy having the sex to watch after her poor little Jason Voorhees. Stricken with grief, Pamela vows to kill all of the counselors that dare to work at Crystal Lake. However, 20 years later, after the tragedy of her son's death, a man named Bill decides that it's time to reopen the camp, and brings a batch of young counselors to help him prepare the grounds. This in turn leads Pamela to return to Crystal Lake to finish what she started. Now, what's the problem with this setup? Well, it's framed as a whodunit. Yeah, all this information I just gave you about Pamela isn't told to the audience until the final act of the movie, meaning that the camp counselors were dropping like flies long before moviegoers are even introduced to Pamela. Now, the setup would be acceptable if hints were being dropped as breadcrumbs for the audience leading up to the reveal, or if Pamela was helping to set up the camp from the beginning of the movie. Alas, none of that happens, and we are left with nothing except a forced revelation that means almost nothing because there was never a foundation to support it. Another issue with Pamela being the killer is that all of these dead bodies start showing up in weird places. People start falling from trees and crap, which leads to serious believability issues, as how the heck did this old granny do any of that? Even with all that being said, I still haven't got to the worst part of this movie. It is so boring. The content of this movie realistically justifies a 45 to 60 minute runtime. Unfortunately, that means we get a bunch of mundane bullcrap to extend this movie to an hour and a half. We get these boring counselors doing boring things like killing snakes, swimming, playing strip Monopoly, and making coffee for 3 minutes straight. Seriously, man, they show the whole process. If you cut this out, it could stand as a how-to tutorial on YouTube. The cherries on top of this crap cake are the abundance of technical deficiencies that plague this movie. The framing feels off, the lighting feels cheap, and the sound design comes off half-baked, with loud psycho-esque music blasting as an attempt to cover up the film's tonal and auditorial issues. While later entries often suffer from these same mechanical problems, they are usually better paced and ripe with more content. If this movie was significantly shorter, I could see it being a fun little Halloween special to return to every now and then. There are some things I like in this movie. While I certainly see more of it than I like, the chemistry between counselors can be charming. Once again, I like the setting, as I feel it has a built-in eerie atmosphere that I can relate to. Lastly, I find the lore here to be fun, as it feels almost like a prequel to the rest of the franchise. The film ends with an incredibly effective jump scare where a zombified Jason Voorhees jumps out of the lake. While it is unclear whether or not this really happened, it serves as a chilling teaser for what is to come. Although there are aspects I certainly enjoy in Friday the 13th, 1980, it is ultimately a tedious slog with little to no payoff that rehashes a way better movie in order to make a quick buck. While its positives allow it to escape the E tier, its negatives bar it from being anywhere close to a passing grade, meaning that Friday the 13th earns itself a D rank.
No problem.
Now I know what you guys are thinking. Budsterbrown, I thought you said you liked this franchise. And believe me, I do. I just don't like the first installment. However, the tides of Crystal Lake turn as soon as the second installment. Now, let me be clear. This isn't Shakespeare. In fact, I feel that Shakespeare is more likely to be afraid of this movie's writing than of Jason. But I feel that this movie takes everything that the first movie did and improves almost everything about it. Now, let's get right into Friday the 13th, Part 2.
Now, the first thing this movie does differently is scrap the whole whodunit formula from the first movie, opting to make Pamela's son, Jason, the killer, and let the audience know that he is the killer right out of the gate. I think that this is a wise choice, as while I don't necessarily hate the concept of a mystery murderer, I find a more straightforward killer to work better in the formula set up by the first movie. This second movie is also enhanced by the first movie, as it is somewhat of a revenge tale. To my knowledge, Jason wasn't really killing anyone before his mom got decapitated, meaning that he is out for revenge. I think that, in and of itself, is pretty cool. But the movie expands upon that in the climax of the film, which leads to a satisfying end. But before I talk about the end, let's talk about the beginning. And once again, the opening of this movie blows the first one out of the water. In Friday the 13th Part 1, the movie starts out with some teenagers about to get busy, before getting interrupted by a blade through the chest. After that, it kinda just ends, and it feels as if it's trying to rip off Halloween, but forgot what made Halloween's cold open so chilling: a good reveal. While this second movie doesn't exactly have a big reveal, it does have an effective payoff. The second movie starts with Alice, the final girl of the first movie, reliving her ordeal at Crystal Lake through the form of a nightmare. A nervous Alice is still traumatized and is trying to forget all that she went through. However, one suspiciously open window later and she arms herself and is ready for a potential killer, only to be confronted with a stray cat. After opening her fridge to get that cat a snack, she immediately sees Pamela Voorhees' head sitting there chillin'. A horrified Alice lets out a scream right before a mysterious man shoves a screwdriver through her head. Now, I'm not going to give the rest of this movie a play-by-play as I did here, but to me, this perfectly illustrates how this movie takes an idea from the first, tweaks it, and makes it much better. There is genuine tension throughout this whole scene, as it feels like someone can pop out of nowhere at any second. Alice's last moments in the first movie had her reflecting on Jason, believing he was still out there. This is a fulfillment of her premonition. It also pulls a Scream, spoilers for Scream by the way, and kills off the protagonist within the first 5 to 10 minutes of this movie. While Alice isn't Drew Barrymore, she was the sole survivor of the first movie and the one that killed Jason's mother. It'd be like if Laurie Strode just got capped at the beginning of Halloween 2. Now, this opening isn't perfect. The cutting between a wide shot of Alice in bed and her flashbacks from the first movie is pretty shoddy and goofy looking. I think that the scene goes on a tad bit too long and everything looks about as cheap as the first film. That being said, I think that this is an incredibly effective opening and one of the best in the entire franchise. After this, though, it more or less continues the pattern of the first film, albeit a little bit better. Young adult, horny counselors are getting ready to set up a camp that is close to Crystal Lake. The leader, Paul, is dating a strawberry blonde girl named Jenny, and one by one the camp counselors start getting killed off, leading to a showdown between the killer and the final girl, which happens to be Jenny. Now, while this movie doesn't reinvent the wheel, there are some noticeable differences that are worth mentioning. For starters, there are significantly more counselors in this movie than in the last one. I see this as a positive change, as I didn't really care too much for the personal lives of each counselor in the last movie, rather interactions between eccentric young people that have their individual quirks. I feel that there is a decent amount of variety with the counselors in this one, for better and for worse. Yuck. However, more counselors doesn't just mean more young enthusiasm to feast on, but an abundance of carnage candy. While I actually think the kills are a tad bit better overall in the first movie, the second one has its fair share of good kills, with my favorite of the two movies being with Wheelchair Bro in the second entry. Seriously? This movie is worth watching based on that kill alone. I mean, at least watch that. Now, while everything so far in this movie has been great, there is still an elephant in the room yet to be discussed, as the biggest change between this movie and the first one is that it has a completely different killer, that being Jason Voorhees. Having Jason as the killer completely changes the vibe of the film from the first one. As I mentioned, the first movie had a spooky campfire story atmosphere to it, but that has just been amplified now that Jason is the mainstay. There is even a point where Paul is telling a campfire story about Jason, and while it's all exposition, it's one of my favorite world-building scenes in the movie. Jason is a living, well, I don't know about living, but a walking legend, a boogeyman, a monster, the creature of Crystal Lake. Having him here makes the movie feel more like a monster movie than a slasher at times. Mrs. Voorhees, while somewhat unsettling, doesn't look abnormal, and is all in all a very human woman. On the other hand, Jason is this disfigured monster living in a makeshift shack where he salvages his mother's remains, hiding his face because he knows just how ugly he really is. That's one little tidbit I've always appreciated about Jason. You can genuinely feel his emotions at times, with the man behind the mask making appearances every now and then. While Michael Myers is this blank-faced killer with no inner thoughts or feelings to speak of, Jason seems to have a little bit more going on. Even before Jason drowned, he was ugly. Like, really ugly. and the kids his age didn't hold back their thoughts. I find it interesting that even though Jason is this killer that doesn't really care about what people think, he still hides his face. He's still ashamed of how ugly he is. The only woman that showed him love, that truly cared for him, was his mother, which is why he has this undying loyalty to her. And I do mean undying. Not to be cliche, but as the saying goes, hurt people hurt people. That is Jason Voorhees. But let's throw this pretentiousness out of the window for a second. I mean, come on, it's Friday the 13th. We all know that no one is here to study the psyche of Jason Voorhees. They want a performance review on his first foray into cinema as a murderous monster. And here, I'd say he has a good showing. He's certainly more of a physical presence than his mother. I mean, dude can take a hit, that's for sure. I also like the aesthetic of Jason in this movie. I like to call him Farmer Jason. It feels like you might catch him milking a cow if you wait patiently. While it's not my favorite look for the character, I do like the bag on his face as a precursor to his more iconic look. I also like that this Jason feels a little bit scrappier, as he doesn't feel like an immovable tank like he does in other entries. While I like how it makes Jason feel like he's still learning his trade, it does admittedly make him less intimidating. Jason is a little bit of a klutz in this movie. Bro is slipping and sliding all over the place. While he takes quite a few hits and survives a machete through the shoulder, it doesn't take much to knock him down and render him unconscious for a couple of moments. That being said, I like this version of the character, and if we're out here ranking each movie, might as well rank each Jason while I'm at it. I'm giving Part 2 Jason a B rank.
Too easy for me.
One last thing I want to talk about is the climax of the movie. I think it's really good. Well, for Friday the 13th standards anyway. While there is a lengthy chase scene between Jason and Jenny, some of which I like, and some of which is just alright, Jenny ends up in Jason's broken down shack where she discovers his mother's remains in her sweater. In a spur-of-the-moment decision, Jenny decides to put on Pamela's sweater and trick Jason into believing that she is his mother for a moment. This buys her enough time for Paul to find her and distract Jason while Jenny delivers a nearly fatal blow to Jason with a machete. This leads to Jenny and Paul going back to their cabin thinking all is well until Jason jumps through the window. Once again, not sure if this really happened because Paul and Jenny are still alive at the end, being wheeled into an ambulance, but I digress. I really like this climax. Having Jenny pretend to be Jason's mom is really cool and helps differentiate him from other killers. It taps into that human, boyish element that Jason has, and it's one of my favorite endings in the series. The jump scare at the end, while cliche and ultimately unnecessary, is an effective final scare to leave audiences with. Is it better than the final scare in the first movie? No. But to be fair, it scared me more. I unfortunately got the final scare of the first movie spoiled for me, so I knew it was coming. This one, however, I had no idea, and I was legitimately jumping off the couch when Jason busted through the window and we see his scarred, disfigured face for the first time. Overall, I see this movie as a massive improvement to the first one. It has a significantly better opening and closing. I find the counselors here to be more entertaining due to the higher body count and abundance of interactions. I find this movie to be incredibly paced with very few dull moments to speak of. Jason is a much better villain than Pamela and is also more interesting. While the kills are maybe not quite as good overall, I think the good ones in this movie really shine. This movie certainly isn't perfect. It still looks really cheap. Cinematography-wise, it's not doing anything impressive. While Ginny is a better final girl than Alice, and I like all of the counselors more this time, they still aren't anything that special. There are also some continuity questions that arrive with Jason being alive that aren't really explained, like ever. Did he drown? Did he learn how to swim and hide in the woods for 20 years? Was he revived by his mother's death? Who the flippin' heck knows? The continuity issues only get worse with later entries, but it's still not great here. Despite that though, I really like this one. Friday the 13th Part 2 is a really fun slasher to watch during the Halloween season, and has become a mainstay in my October lineup of movies I like to watch, earning Friday the 13th Part 2 a B rank.
Too easy. Piece of cake.
So Friday the 13th, 1980 established a formula, and the second one expanded off of that formula and improved almost everything about it. How does the third installment capitalize off the ideas of its predecessors? It doesn't.
Oh crap, Jason's real!
Okay, maybe saying that part 3 has no new ideas was a little bit of a stretch. However, cat's out of the bag, not a fan of this movie. With that, let's get into Friday the 13th Part 3, 3D.
Yep, this is what you expect. It's Friday the 13th in 3D, which, believe me, the movie likes to remind you of. Not even in like creative ways, but like this bullcrap right here. To be fair, they do utilize the 3D for one creative kill, and it can be charming in a it's so bad it's good type of way. But for the most part, it doesn't add anything, and maybe even detracts. Now, this movie strays from its originators in a couple of ways. In parts 1 and 2, our cast of teenagers are camp counselors, but here they're friends going on a little vacation. This sets a series trend, as we don't really get camp counselors that much more in future installments. It also starts the series stereotype of the final girl having some sort of personal trauma that directly connects to Jason. Jason returning to this movie cements him as the main icon of the Friday the 13th franchise, and is even the first movie where he dons his iconic hockey mask. However, while I recognize his merits, I'm not a huge fan of this version of Jason. While Jason in the last might have come off as a little small, this version of Jason straight up looks like a monster. He looks like the Creeper from Scooby-Doo, but if he wore a hockey mask. This movie also leads me to believe that it takes place right after the second one. Like, this is clearly a different human being. I'm also not huge on the way he moves. It looks kinda awkward and silly. However, he is large and somewhat intimidating, and I have to give him points for being the first one to wear the hockey mask. All these things in mind, I'm giving this version of Jason a C rank.
That wasn't so hard.
Back to Friday the 13th 3D though. I think the main reason I don't like this movie, similarly to the first, is that I just find it to be boring and lazy. Spoiler alert for future movies, but I'm not really a fan of the final girls that have a personal connection and trauma with Jason. It always feels forced, and has me scratching my head as to when these interactions take place within the continuity. In part 3, final girl Chris relays her trauma about being attacked by some hideous man, seemingly years prior. How many years? Who knows? Was Jason still in the lake? When did Jason get out of the lake? Why does he look massive in the flashback when in the previous entry he looked relatively small? These are all questions that Friday the 13th Part 3 has no interest in answering. I will say that this does lead to some interesting headcanon for the franchise, and at the end of the video, I'll share some of my own theories that I have. But for this movie in particular, it comes off as a sloppy attempt to tie Jason to the final girl. But speaking of the final girl, Chris Higgins is the girl that owns the house off Crystal Lake that she and her friends are vacationing to. And I got to say, these are the worst side characters to grace the series so far. None of them stand out at all. They're all pieces of wood, stock, boring. The only side character that has some shred of personality is Shelly, the prankster that makes jokes to get attention, mostly to hide his insecurities that no one really likes him. And he sure got that part right, because I hate this mother fricker. He is so annoying, and I was just waiting for Jason to kill him the entire movie. The kills in this movie are fine. I'd say it has two standouts, one being the aforementioned 3D kill, and I'm also a fan of the groovy opening credits, even though it would feel more at home with Scooby-Doo than Friday the 13th, but that's okay. Man, that's like the second time I brought up Scooby-Doo. Maybe we need a crossover. Yeah, but other than that, this movie just bored me, and I was waiting for the credits to roll through the majority of the runtime. For being one of, if not my least favorite of the franchise, Friday the 13th 3D earns itself an E rank.
Barely made it.
Alright guys, we've made it to my favorite movie in the Friday the 13th franchise. This movie here is peak Now, when I think about why I like the movies in this franchise, this is the one that pops into my mind and is always on my October watch list. With that, let's get into Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter.
That's a lie, by the way. It's not the final chapter. We still got 10 movies to go. To kick off, this movie is the first one that finally got Jason right in my eyes. It's a little bit of a mix of Part 2 and Part 3, which is the perfect balance to me. I like his build, I like his outfit, I think his physicality and movements are great. Once we see his face, it is grotesque and monstrous, with just enough humanity there that I can see what Jason might have looked like before he took all that damage. I have no complaints here, and only praise to offer. Part 4 Jason earns himself an A rank.
Ultimate victory.
The next thing that really elevates this movie in my mind is the tone. The creators nailed the balance of humor and tension. As it's self-aware, it knows what it is. It's not trying to be Halloween anymore, it's trying to be Friday the 13th. There are all these funny bits throughout the movie. The side characters in this movie are so goofy, but because of that, they're pretty memorable. There is this awkward guy that just wants a girl and his slick friend that maybe isn't quite as slick as he thinks he is. You got a pair of twins that compete with each other, an innocent girl trying to experience a romance for the first time. Each of these characters have their little baby arcs and plots going on that feels straight out of a high school-based soap opera. That being said, it's charming and endearing and thoroughly entertaining me in the gaps of time where Jason isn't on screen or being talked about. Speaking of side characters though, there are about 2 different sets, the aforementioned rowdy teenagers that rented out a house near Crystal Lake, and their neighbors, the Jarvis family. While the teenage crowd are more or less oblivious to Jason's presence in this movie up until they are murdered, the Jarvis family is somewhat aware, as a hunter is looking for Jason to take him out, and informs the family that he is coming. I like how they structured this because it gives differing scenarios when encountering Jason. We get the dramatic irony with the teenage group, as while the audience knows Jason is coming, these teenagers don't have a clue, helping us experience Jason for the first time through these characters. On the flip side, we have the people in the know that are ready to take Jason on and potentially defeat him. It's a way of giving the audience hope that someone can stop Jason while also giving plenty of interesting bodies that Jason can tally. And with that, let's get into this movie's kills. Friday the 13th, the final chapter, has the best overall quality of kills thus far and gives plenty of variety. There are a few kills that are just straight cutaways in this movie, as the creators really cooked here. They show just enough to allow the audience's imagination to do some heavy lifting. My favorite kill in this movie is when Jason punches through a shower door and straight crushes someone's face. But there are plenty of others that could take top spot. These kills are also aided by great improvement in the cinematography department, as I find this movie to be the first one in the franchise that doesn't look cheap and offers some sort of value from a filmmaking perspective. Moving on to this movie's endgame, I think it's really good. Jason is busting through doors, punching through windows, killing hunters, which is all great spectacle. This movie takes a page out of 2's playbook and has Tommy Jarvis distract Jason by bringing attention to Jason's past, with Tommy making himself look as close as he could to Jason's younger self, which doesn't come out of nowhere. Tommy from the beginning was shown to make costumes and decorations as a hobby, so this isn't out of the blue. After Jason's face slides down a machete, which has amazing practical effects by the way, Tommy starts going ham on Jason, potentially teasing him as the killer in the future. This is the only element of the movie that I don't really care for, as I don't need some cliffhanger that makes me think Tommy's gonna be a killer someday. Other than that though, this movie is a blast. I enjoy almost every second of it. The kills are gnarly, Jason is basically perfect in his own menacing way. The side characters are enjoyable, the cinematography is actually solid, and the movie has a pretty satisfying finale. The film finds the perfect balance between humor and tension that makes it endlessly rewatchable for the Halloween season. Friday the 13th, the final chapter, is the perfect Friday the 13th movie, earning itself a well-deserved A rank.
That was cool!
Crap.
Okay, like part 3, I don't have a whole lot to say about this movie. It goes without saying that this is a massive downgrade from the last movie, but that doesn't mean it's terrible, right? Well, it does do some new and interesting things that are worth talking about, so let's not delay this any further and get right into Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning.
I would say the most notable thing about this movie is the return to the whodunit formula from the first movie, though I actually think it is a little bit better done here, with special emphasis on a little. I think it's better because there are just more suspects to go around with more questions to be asked. Jason is back as the killer, but Tommy Jarvis is back as well. In the last movie, it was teased that Tommy Jarvis might act on some violence within him, and at the beginning of this movie, Tommy has a nightmare about Jason, showing that he is very much still thinking about him. Is Jason actually back, or is crazy Tommy donning a hockey mask in his free time? Well, the answer is neither, which is disappointing and lazy, but unlike the first movie, at least there was some ideas being thrown around. This movie takes place at a mental institution for troubled people in a place called the Pinehurst Halfway House, where Tommy Jarvis is being relocated to. The inciting incident is some dude offers this guy chopping wood at a chocolate bar, and the chopping wood guy responds to the chocolate bar guy by killing him with an axe. Why? I don't know, but they're at a mental institution, so I guess it makes sense. Anyways, chocolate bar guy's dad was so upset at his son being killed, he decided to dress up as Jason Voorhees and murder everybody? What? Yeah, that's the reveal, and it's so lazy. Other than that, this movie is standard Friday the 13th, with horny teenagers getting killed off until a climax between Jason and Tommy Jarvis takes place. The side characters are fine, but nothing special. There is significantly more nudity in this movie for some reason, so if that's your thing, then here you are. However, the trade-off seems to be that the movie looks incredibly cheap again like the first 3 entries, so I don't know what happened in that department. The kills are forgettable, the plot is forgettable, nothing really stands out at all. That being said, I can't say I was bored watching it, and I probably wouldn't mind watching it again despite it not really being that good, meaning that Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, barely escapes a D rank, earning itself a not so well deserved C rank.
Just made it.
Also, this guy's not really a Jason because technically it's just the chocolate bar guy's dad, but he was okay, but nothing special. I'm giving him a D rank.
Maybe I didn't try hard enough.
Okay, so despite killing off Jason in Part 4 and embracing the mystery killer route in Part 5, it didn't take long for Paramount Pictures to realize that audiences just kind of want to see Jason, and I think that's okay. I'm not morally opposed to the whodunit formula, but it's clear that Friday the 13th didn't really have the chops to pull that off effectively, so I really prefer the outings where Jason is the big bad. Save the Scooby-Doo mystery solving for the Scream franchise, and again with the Scooby-Doo, what is happening? Anyway, let's get right into Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives.
As I was just alluding to, Jason makes an epic return in this movie, as does Tommy Jarvis, though he is played by Tom Matthews this time as opposed to John Shepard from the last movie. Who do I prefer? Well, I feel like I have to go with Matthews by default, as Tommy Jarvis in the last movie was a nothing character, kind of like all the characters in the last movie. How did it get a C rank again? But to be fair to Matthews, he has a lot more going for him than just being better than Shepard. He brings a lot of energy to the role, whether he is afraid or a man on a mission. I find this to be the definitive version of Tommy Jarvis, the go-to example that I think of when the character comes to mind. I also like him as a foil to Jason. In every way that Tommy is human and caring, Jason is cold and robotic. Not an actual robot though, unfortunately I have to clarify that in this franchise. There is just a connection between these two where Jason is out to get Tommy and Tommy is out to get Jason. It's not deep. I mean, It's Friday the 13th we're talking about here. We're lucky to get shallow with this franchise. However, it is an aspect of this movie that makes it entertaining, and it keeps me invested as I'm waiting for some type of showdown between Jason and Tommy that isn't forced. As I mentioned, I'm not a fan of when the writers manufacture these bullcrap connections between Jason and other final girls, and I'm very happy to say that Part 6 doesn't fall into that category. Now, I've talked about Tommy, but have yet to get into the main event, Jason Voorhees, who is essentially a zombie in this movie. You see Tommy and his friend visit Jason's dead body to indeed make sure that he is dead. After confirming Jason is dead and gone, Tommy, mirroring his actions at the end of Part 4, starts stabbing Jason's dead carcass with a metal rod. This metal rod gets struck by lightning, and this somehow brings Jason back to life. I'm sorry guys, I need a quick second here. What in the holy fudge nuggets is going on? If you couldn't tell already, Part 6 is a little bit goofy. Really goofy. However, you could make a case that all of the Friday the 13th movies are pretty goofy in their own right. I think that the difference with Part 6 is that they seemingly plan to be silly from the get-go, as it's woven into this movie. How do I like this shift? Well, I'd say it works. Sure, I prefer when they take it a little bit more seriously, with the final chapter being my example of the perfect ratio of goof to tension. But because of how silly this movie is, it is easy to recommend to almost anybody. This movie is really funny, sometimes in a dark way, and it is a total blast to turn on in October and watch with your friends, more so than a lot of movies on this list. If Part 4 is the best example of a more serious Friday the 13th movie, I would say that Part 6 is the best example of a more campy one. Back to Jason, I like this version of him. Is it my favorite? No, but I like him. I would say that this Jason's greatest strength is, well, his strength. While Jason in other movies was certainly stronger than the average human, you can tell that Part 6 Jason poured all his XP into the strength stat, because now he is inhumanly powerful. There's even one scene where he accidentally tears off an arm and is just, well, I knew I was strong, but I didn't know I was like that strong. Seeing Jason throw people across rooms and snap people in half like they're a folding chair is the #1 thing that brings Part 6 Jason to the table. I also generally like the way he moves around. It has a lot of presence and exudes strength and confidence. The thing that holds this Jason back for me though is the outfit. I'm not the one to come up with this, but bro looks like he just got off a shift at Home Depot. I think the mask looks great, but other than that, he looks like he just knocked on your door to install that new ceiling fan. Which means that I am not a fan. I also think the kills in this movie are significantly toned down. Outside of Jason ripping someone's heart out like he's Kano from Mortal Kombat, there really aren't that many good kills here. That being said, I feel that Part 6 Jason gets the job done and works really well in this movie. My only real complaint is that the outfit makes him look like Bob the Builder at times, but other than that, he's awesome. Part 6 Jason earns himself a B rank.
Too easy for me.
Back to the movie though, I feel that it does a lot of things that expand off the Friday the 13th formula that could maybe go unappreciated. While I don't think the kills themselves are very special, you get a ton of variety in who Jason kills. Having a picnic with your girl in the woods, Jason kills you. Car broke down in the woods, Jason kills you. Having a little bit to drink to enjoy your night off, Jason kills you. Going camping in an RV, Jason slams your face into the bathroom wall. This movie basically covers every single scenario a person could be in while camping, and has Jason, well, kill you. It adds an element of relatability because the chances are that you have been one of these people in your life. Granted, I can't say that I was super scared, but there is an element of spontaneity to Jason that makes him terrifying. Another thing that separates this movie from the rest of the franchise is that it is the only one where the summer camp is in session. That's right, the camp counselors in this movie finally have a chance to do their jobs, as now there are kids at Crystal Lake. The movie creates a lot of dramatic irony, as the local police department doesn't believe Jason is back. And honestly, I don't blame them at first. However, us as the audience knows that he's heading straight towards Crystal Lake, where a bunch of children are waiting to potentially be slaughtered. We as the audience hope that the police will catch on before Jason finds the kids, leading to some truly tense sequences that are some of the best in the movie. I would also like to say that this movie is the last one that capitalizes on the camp counselor motif established by the first two movies, and for that reason I have a soft spot for it. Frankly, it uses that format in a much more effective way than the first two movies ever did. One last praise I have for this movie is that it is genuinely shot really well, maybe even better than Part 4. I'm not saying we're at Martin Scorsese levels of filmmaking here, but there are some really cool atmospheric shots that feel like they're paying homage to the classical monster movies that inspired Jason in the first place. Overall, I think this movie sits among the best of the Friday the 13th catalog. It's really funny, paced super well, has plenty of tense moments that will have you gripping your seat while also having fun characters to root for. While he looks a little funny, Jason is at the top of his game in this movie and brings a great presence to the film. I think this movie plays with the established formula in fun and unique ways that make it a cut above your average slasher flick. I would go as far to say that this movie by far is the most accessible Friday the 13th movie in the entire franchise, and easily earns itself an A rank.
That was cool!
What's up, bro?
Wow! Carson! What the heck are you doing here?
I was just walking, enjoying Mother Nature. What are you doing on the floor of the pavilion?
Never mind that. Let's get going.
What?
Jason Voorhees is real and he's trying to kill us.
Whoa, calm down. Are you crazy? I think you need to go home.
Jason is real and he's right behind you.
Yeah, right. He's right behind me. He's right behind me. Hi. Hi.
Carson. I tried to tell him. Okay. So after the subpar box office performance of Part 6, the people in charge of these movies seemed to believe that the franchise was running out of steam, needing more than a couple of horny camp counselors to sell tickets. And to be fair, they probably weren't wrong. While varying in quality, the last 6 movies were seen as more or less the same in the eyes of audience members. Having a distinct fresh spin on things could bring new eyes to the franchise and keep the money rolling in. While on paper I can't disagree with this strategy, in execution they mostly fumbled the bag. To be fair, this next entry isn't the worst offender in what I consider to be the gimmicky Friday the 13th movies. That comes later, so stay tuned. But for now, let's get into Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood.
Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood is not that good, but not that bad. Yeah, this is another middle-of-the-road Friday the 13th movie, but it has a couple of noteworthy things to talk about. The biggest twist in this formula is that the movie follows a girl named Tina, who discovered she had psychic abilities when she accidentally killed her dad at Crystal Lake when she was a little girl. When returning to her old house as a teenager, she senses a presence still living in the lake. Thinking it is her dad, she calls out to it. Unfortunately for her, it is none other than our favorite hockey mask-wearing killer, Jason Voorhees. Once Jason is revived, she realizes that it wasn't her dad and tries to warn everyone that Jason is coming back. Unfortunately, her a-hole psychologist decides to gaslight her and pretend that nothing is happening, despite he himself knowing that something is going on. Why did he not tell anyone? I'm not sure, but shockingly it doesn't work out for him, as he doesn't live to see the credits roll. And that pretty much kicks off the movie. Jason starts killing off horny teenage neighbors before having a showdown with Tina, where she uses her psychic powers to hold off Jason. However, the way she defeats him is by reviving her dad that she killed, who jumps out of the lake and drags Jason down. What am I watching? It's worth noting that this dude looks like he's been underwater for about 20 seconds, when supposedly he's been dead and decomposing for over a decade now. But it's fine. It's okay. Maybe Tina healed his wounds before coming up. I don't freaking know. Now, outside of Tina having psychic powers, this movie is about as standard as it gets. House full of teenagers are all partying and trying to have sex with each other that ultimately get killed off. While I think some of these side characters are entertaining, they are once again nothing special. The kills in this movie are also some of, if not the worst in the franchise. So many cutaway deaths where nothing is shown, and not in that Alfred Hitchcock type of way where you're leaving more for the imagination. More like the MPAA said it would be an X-rated film if you don't tone down the violence type of way. I personally haven't looked into it, so I don't know if that's the case. It's just what I think is probably the most likely. I think what saves this movie from getting a D rank or even an E rank is that it is my favorite looking version of Jason. As previously stated, I liked pretty much everything about Jason in Part 6 other than the way he looked. And this is the one thing I feel Part 7 improves on. I love how Jason's body looks like it's disintegrating, decomposing due to his extended time underwater. His bones are visible through his tattered clothes, which is already a nice touch. His mask has taken so much damage over the course of the franchise that it looks like it's barely being held together. And when Tina rips the mask off, it reveals Jason's zombified face, which is my favorite unmasked look of the killer. Outside of the aesthetic, I feel that the physicality of the character in this movie is perfect. It feels as if the creators finally got a good handle on how Jason should move and act. I would also say they got that right in Part 6, but with the improved character design, I really think it shines here. Part 7 Jason earns himself an A rank.
Ultimate victory.
Should that be enough to save this movie? Maybe not, but what can I say? Sometimes the little things matter. Beyond Jason being cool though, I think this movie is fine enough. I think the middle chunk of the movie provides an adequate Friday the 13th experience, and the final battle between Jason and Tina differentiates this movie enough to make it feel unique. The kills in this movie are no good, and it's ultimately very average, which is why Friday the 13th Part 7 The New Blood barely scrapes by with a C rank.
Just made it.
Following the trend of gimmicky Friday the 13th movies, this next entry takes Jason out of his comfort zone and throws him into one of the largest cities in America, Manhattan. While audiences were excited to see Jason take a bite out of the Big Apple, he only ended up taking a small nibble. Without further ado, let's get into Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan.
Like the previous entry, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, is not good. But I love it anyway. If clickbait could be described as a movie, this would be it. You see that? You see that right there? Jason Takes Manhattan? The only thing Jason takes is a boat ride for an hour, and then the last 2 seconds decides, hey, why not stop by Times Square? Don't expect Jason to be climbing Empire State Building, or taking a trip to the Chrysler Building, because I'ma tell you right now, it ain't happening. They have this montage of New York shenanigans at the beginning of this movie for like 5 minutes that feels straight out of the 90s Ninja Turtles movie. As if to remind the audience, yes, Jason will be here eventually, don't you worry. Now, I have to get that out of the way, because I can imagine quite a few people being excited for Jason's Broadway showing, only to be met with Jason Lost at Sea. However, I have to say, I had a really good time with this movie. Like I mentioned in my review of Part 7, this is where the gimmicky movies are most prevalent, and this movie is no exception. However, I actually think the variety here is better woven into the plot than the last movie. We get to see Jason in places we haven't before. Granted, it's mostly on water, but it's still pretty cool. You have a recreational boat where 2 seniors are celebrating, as well as a big old yacht full of all types of rooms, one being a bar, a disco dance floor, a boiler-looking room that reminded me of Nightmare on Elm Street, which is not the last time Freddy will be coming up in this video. And of course, the command deck. After that, we see Jason at the dock, Jason on rooftops, Jason in the subway, Jason at Times Square, and Jason in the sewer. There's more variety in location than we've ever seen before, and I think this movie utilizes that diversity effectively. You get a couple of creative kills, and it's just fun to see Jason in new environments. When it comes to the side characters, they're overall just alright. I like the obnoxious principal guy, the bratty privileged popular girl, the nerd trying to get with the popular girl, and so on. I will say that this is for sure a weaker final girl, as she is crazy forgettable and has that tacked on connection with Jason that may or may not conflict with continuity. However, there is one side character that I particularly like, and that is my main man, Julius. This dude was so fly, so clean, that I was genuinely rooting for his survival. Once people on the ship find out about Jason, Julius doesn't want to just sit around. He's like, hey bro, how about we all get into groups and start hunting this guy down? Now, does anyone do that? No, they all go by themselves, but that's okay because he had the thought of let's take things into our own hands. And I like that. I like that a lot. One aspect that I like about almost all of these movies is finding a side character that just speaks to you for whatever reason and cheering them on. I find it makes this series way more fun to watch, and it feels more like cheering for your favorite sports team than actually caring about them as a deep and calculated character. Now, that doesn't mean your character will make it. In fact, they're more likely to die than survive. But my main man's Julius did a lot. Bro started boxing Jason like he was Apollo Creed, going out in the most metal way you could. Also like, well, Apollo Creed. Jason also helps make Part 8 work. Between this one and Part 7, his back must be hurting from carrying these movies all by himself. I feel like Jason has more personality here than in other entries. Bro is kicking trash cans, allowing Julius to punch himself out for some reason, even though he could just easily decapitate him whenever he felt like it. Jason just feels like a man on a mission, and he ain't gonna stop till he completes it. The outfit is reminiscent of Part 6, but I like it a little bit more here. It comes off very slick and dark, and I feel it contrasts really well with the hockey mask. No, I do have to briefly mention here that Part 8 Jason shines a particularly bright light on a glaring issue with slashers and Jason in general, and that is their ability to seemingly teleport at times. Now, Jason doesn't canonically have the ability to teleport, but if you watch this movie, you might seriously think he does. In other movies, you could at least tell yourself, he's probably running off camera. They just don't want to show it because it might look goofy. This movie, though, he straight up could not get to the places he gets to in the speed in which he gets to those places without the ability to teleport. Did it take away from my enjoyment of the movie? No, but it is very noticeable and it had me scratching my head on more than a few occasions. That being said, not gonna lie, this is a great Jason and I think he just barely squeezes out an A rank.
Ultimate victory.
The ending of this movie is a little weird though. Not as weird as the last one, but they try this thing where Jason becomes a metaphorical child again or something. I don't really know, but to be fair, confusion at the end of these movies seems to be a common trend, with parts 1, 2, 3, and 7 being very much guilty of the same crime. I will also say that the pacing of this movie is really weird. They spend so much time on the Lazarus boat, which I think is a really funny name because Jason keeps coming back from the dead, that you kind of forget about the whole Takes Manhattan thing. By the time we get to New York, it feels more like an encore than a closing act, but I was still more or less invested from start to finish, despite the admittedly strange pacing. Outside of that though, I found this movie to be entertaining. Jason is just a riot to watch in action, and seeing this version of the character in all these different settings is a ton of fun. The final girl is kinda mid, but I really liked the character Julius for some reason and found myself more invested in the movie because of him. There's a decent variety of kills and the movie never overstayed its welcome for me. Friday the 13th Part 8 Jason Takes Manhattan is a blast, especially if you're watching it with someone else. While this movie is probably closer to a C rank, I think it entertained me enough that I'm willing to be generous and give it a B rank.
Too easy. Piece of cake.
Oh boy, here we go. Do you remember when I said most of these movies stick to a formula, but there are a couple of outliers? This is one of those outliers, and while I can respect it for trying something new, it's about all I can respect, because this movie fails on so many levels that it's comical. But let's get this over as fast as possible and dismantle the atrocity that is Jason Goes to Hell.
First, let me say a couple things I like about it. I think this movie is actually pretty funny at times. They have a lot of cleverly written bits that got a pretty decent chuckle out of me. I think the production design and visuals, for Friday the 13th standards anyway, are above average, with some great practical effects, makeup work, and cinematography. I specifically think it's really cool when Jason, air quotes there, leaves the sheriff's body and we see it decompose in front of our eyes. I also really like the scene where Jason finally gets dragged to hell. Other than that though, yeesh. Now, this movie opens with Jason chasing some hot naked chick who jumps behind a bright light, and then a SWAT team comes out and literally blows Jason up. We see Jason's beating heart lying on the ground as the beats slowly crawl to a halt. We then get an opening credit sequence that is intertwined with a coroner examining Jason's dead body, commenting on how damaged his remains look, which was a nice little nod to how much Jason has been through. Now, I'm gonna be honest, at this point in time, I was fully hooked and excited to see what happened next. However, right as I found myself wondering why people didn't like this movie, the coroner, out of nowhere, eats Jason's beating heart, which possesses him and transfers Jason's consciousness into the coroner. And then I knew whatever was going to happen in this movie was something truly terrible. Was I right? No. It was even worse than I thought. Now, I could give you all a play-by-play of this movie, plot beat for plot beat, but frankly, I am going to save you all from losing brain cells and not go over it extensively. All I'll say is, outside of the aforementioned positives, this movie executes nothing well. It doesn't execute its premise well, the characters all suck, I found myself rooting for absolutely nobody, and this movie rips off everything imaginable. Straight up, the movie's explanation for why Jason can survive so much and never die is because his mom, Pamela Voorhees, stole the Book of the Dead from Sam Raimi's Evil Dead series to turn Jason into a deadite that can only revive himself through possessing another Voorhees, and Jason can only truly die by the hand of another Voorhees. How did they not get sued for this? Not only is that the stupidest and laziest plot point in the Friday the 13th franchise, not only does it make zero sense, they don't even stick with that logic. Jason revives himself with a dead Voorhees body, something he could have done early in the movie, but he also gets killed by a Voorhees and comes back for 2 more movies. The writers weren't even trying to hide the fact that this was going to happen. They tease Freddy versus Jason at the end of this movie. And also, how the frick does this bounty hunter guy who kept spouting lore dumps know any of this crap? Dude just catches killers but knows this as if it's some fact he read, and there is like no way he would know any of this. There are so many plot holes and so many inconsistencies in this movie that I can't even go over all of them. There are just way too many. Do yourself a favor and skip this one unless you are really, really curious. This movie earns an E rank.
Barely made it.
Oh, but don't worry. I didn't forget about Jason either. He earns an E rank as well for being terribly designed and barely in the movie.
I guess I'm not at full power here.
In this next entry, Jason goes to space. That's pretty cool. Granted, anything's going to be better than the abomination that was Jason Goes to Hell, but even still, I don't think this movie ranks among the franchise's worst. It's not perfect, in fact, I would say it's actually pretty bad, but I think it's fun in its own way. With that, let's get into Jason X.
I'm going to do the opposite of the last entry and first talk about this movie's negatives. For starters, this is the cheapest looking Friday the 13th movie since Part 5. I believe this movie was shot on all digital, and it really shows. Everything from the lighting to the costumes to the set design scream low budget student film. When we're not getting some of the worst CGI that has ever graced cinemas, we're getting these laser tag looking sets that are supposed to represent the inside of a spaceship. This movie is butt ugly, and there is no getting around that. The side characters in this movie also seem to not care about their own lives very much. I get that the screaming woman from previous entries can be annoying sometimes, but at least they seem to realize that their mortal existence was coming to an end. In Jason X, people act like dying is about as sad as missing a high school football game. While I'm on the side characters, I gotta say, most of them either suck or are super annoying. The acting from these side characters is also pretty subpar. Not that it's usually great, but this felt bad for even Friday the 13th standards. There are a couple standouts, and I'll get to them later, but for the most part, I was just waiting for these people to get killed off so I wouldn't have to listen to their nonsense any longer. Lastly, I think the pacing isn't that great. I was watching this movie with my brother, and just as we thought it was over, we realized we had about 45 minutes left. and it's a big no-no when Friday the 13th movies overstay their welcome. I know that seems like a lot of bad, and to be fair, there are a buttload of flaws in this movie, but I think that this movie offers up plenty of value that Friday the 13th fans can sink their teeth into. Kicking things off, Jason is really awesome here. Both regular Jason and the souped up robotic one. While I think the costume design is pretty bad on everyone, I'm happy to say that Jason is the exception, as I find his regular outfit and Uber Jason suit to still look pretty good. I know I probably sound like a broken record, but this Jason brings a ton of physical presence to the role and can be pretty scary when he wants to be. I will say though that out of all of the Jasons thus far and in the future, this one reminds me the most of Michael Myers for some reason. I don't know if it's because he's so stealthy or if it's just the way he lingers before he kills, but it was just something I felt while watching the movie. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy. That being said, this Jason still earns himself a respectable B rank.
Too easy for me.
Segueing off Jason, the kills he brings to this movie are actually pretty good. The first kill he has once he wakes up on the spaceship straight up feels like a Sub-Zero fatality. But it's not only that one. He has a couple of creative and fun kills in this movie that are treated with appropriate levels of camp from the side characters. I also mentioned in my Part 8 review that I like seeing Jason in different settings, and while not quite as diverse as Part 8, I feel like there is a decent variety here, at least when compared to the empty woods and cabins we're used to in this franchise. We see Jason in a government facility in a spaceship, which isn't exactly a globe-trotting adventure. I mean, they are off-worlds, so I mean, kind of is. But it kind of feels like if Jason was on an episode of Star Trek, and that's kind of cool. Like I said, I didn't like most of the side characters, and I was happy to see them go. However, I did like a couple of them. There is this douchey principal that is so arrogant and selfish that I couldn't help but be entertained by him, especially because I knew that there was no way he was going to make it. Sergeant Brodsky was another standout, as I felt he was a character that was so surely dead about like 27 times, but somehow kept on surviving and making it further than I ever expected he would. He's also super manly and never backed down from a challenge, which is just something I like in characters. Gave me flashbacks to Julius sometimes, and y'all know how I feel about Julius. Lastly, I thought the final girl Rowan is one of the best ones in the franchise, as she and Jason are from the same time period. You see, the reason Jason was even in space is because this girl decided to cryogenically freeze Jason and herself in a government facility in order to stop Jason from escaping out into the world. 400 plus years later, and high schoolers on a field trip find both of them, bring them onto their spaceship, and revive the girl while assuming Jason is dead and gone. It's okay guys, 400 years ago people made the same mistake. In these Friday the 13th movies, there is usually someone who is always warning people about Jason. In the first and second movie it was Crazy Ralph. The fourth had the Hunter, 6 had Tommy Jarvis, 7 had Tina, 8 had that random dude on the boat, I don't know what his name is, and Part 9 had the Bounty Hunter that served as the Voorhees ex Evil Dead lore master on his free time. I like how Rowan is the person who's warning everyone about Jason in this movie. And it makes sense because she knows him firsthand and dealt with government officials in the past telling her that they could easily handle Jason right before getting killed by him. It's one of those few times where the connection between the final girl and Jason actually feels really natural and adds to the plot as opposed to detracting from it. I also like how the arrogance of the past government officials parallels that of the people in the future. Everyone on the ship in the future thinks that there is nothing to worry about, as how could Jason be a threat to people as advanced as they are? However, as the movie goes on, they realize that maybe they should have taken Rowan's warnings a bit more seriously. Out of all of the intellectual ideas this movie pushes out, and believe me, there aren't many, this is the one that sticks with me. I've seen this idea a lot these days about how we're so much more advanced now, and now we have everything under control, when we're honestly not as high and mighty as we think we are. Every generation has so much hubris that they're the ones to finally figure things out, and frankly that's rarely the case. But enough of my pretentiousness, you know I love to be. Straight up, I found Jason X to be really fun. I thought it had some of the best kills in the franchise, the premise is so ridiculous it's entertaining, and Jason's energy and charisma contrasted well against the few characters I enjoyed in the movie. That being said, the movie isn't paced the the best, and you might find yourself wondering when the credits are going to finally roll. Most of the characters are pretty annoying, and the movie looks incredibly cheap on every calculable visual level. While I'm tempted to give it a B rank for the positives it brings to the table, I just can't quite justify it with all of its negatives, especially keeping in mind that I feel this movie was designed to be so bad that it's good from its inception, meaning that Jason X earns itself a C rank.
Just made it.
Okay, so from this point on, we're essentially in the bonus rounds of the Friday the 13th. As I was saying, we're essentially in the bonus rounds of the Friday the 13th franchise, as Jason X is the last entry in the mainline series. While some might argue it's Part 8 because it's the last one to bear the Friday the 13th name, well, other than the reboot, I like to think of Jason X as the final chapter. Well, not Part 4, but the actual final chapter. With that, let's get right into Freddy versus Jason.
Now, from a continuity perspective, I feel it's safe to say that this movie takes place between Jason Goes to Hell and Jason X, as they tease Freddy at the end of Part 9, as well as imply that Jason may or may not be in Hell at the beginning of this movie. Plus, it can't take place after Jason X, as that takes place 400 years in the future. The only other theory someone could potentially throw out is this movie takes place in a separate continuity, which I see as a pretty valid perspective. However, I like to think of this movie taking place after Part 9, it's just my personal preference. When it comes to the formula of Freddy vs. Jason, like Jason Goes to Hell, it's an outlier. However, unlike Jason Goes to Hell, I'd say that that's a good thing here. Despite not being as well versed in Nightmare on Elm Street, I think it's pretty clear that the creators structured this more like a Freddy movie than a Friday the 13th movie, which I actually think is a smart move overall. While I prefer Friday the 13th to Nightmare on Elm Street, Jason fits better into a Freddy movie than Freddy would fit into a Jason movie. That being said, I think they tinker with the Nightmare on Elm Street formula enough to fit Jason into the narrative in a clever way. I won't give too much of an in-depth look at Nightmare on Elm Street, as I feel that franchise deserves its own video one day. But essentially, they generally start with Freddy killing someone in a dream, panic starting to spread, and people trying to stay awake to buy themselves enough time to figure out how to stop Freddy Krueger. Now, I bring this up because it's important to how this movie unfolds, as everyone has forgotten about Freddy, and without people to fear him, Freddy has no power. So, Freddy wakes Jason up from his power nap and essentially plops him on Elm Street, knowing that people will think Freddy is the one doing the killing, and thus giving Freddy his power back. While this is hammy and ridiculous, I think this works as a solid enough inciting incident. After Jason murders a few people, he takes a back seat and the regular Elm Street plot starts to take over. People try to find out what happened, Freddy starts making his way into people's dreams, and gains enough power to finally kill someone. However, just as Freddy is about to get his first kill of the movie, Jason pulls the ultimate gamer move and steals Freddy's kill, which naturally pisses Freddy off. Jason doesn't stop there though, as he drops the stealth act that he usually has and ends up going to a party and having some fun. And by fun, I mean murdering everyone he can get his hands on. After Jason makes himself very well known, people no longer have Freddy in mind at all, as they have all come to the conclusion that it must be Jason doing the killing, and not this Freddy Krueger guy. This is where the movie stops being a Nightmare on Elm Street movie and becomes the collab that it was meant to be. Freddy now has a good reason to put his sights on Jason, and the story finally has these two titans throw down. While I'd still say it more or less follows the Elm Street formula, as the group of teens are still trying to find a way to pull Freddy into the real world so that they can defeat him, it feels balanced because this movie decides to make Jason the hero? Well, sort of. In pro wrestling terms, they turn Jason into a babyface and have Freddy Krueger play the heel. In a lot of ways, Jason feels like the protagonist of the movie, and as a fan of Jason, I'm completely here for it. Out of the two, Jason is by far the more sympathetic, as while Freddy is a fast-talking, child-murdering pedophile who kills teenagers for fun, Jason feels more like a product of his environment. People forget that Jason was basically a special needs child that was super ugly, that got bullied by all the kids his age and then pushed into a lake to drown. Nobody cared enough to help, and no one was watching to save him. The only person that even cared he died was his mother, which is why her example of violence in guarding Crystal Lake had such a profound impact on Jason. And Freddy vs. Jason really plays into that. This movie, weirdly enough, gives a more comprehensive look at Jason than any of the other Friday the 13th movies. While there was always something tragic about Jason in my mind, it didn't really click with me until I watched this movie. Jason is basically a result of bad parenting. He really is just a big old child that was trained to kill because of the love he had for his mother, and this movie really shined a light on that idea, recontextualizing the character to me when rewatching all of these movies. There's this weird innocence to the way Jason kills people as opposed to the malicious nature of Freddy. Now, don't get me wrong, they're both terrible people at the end of the day that need to be stopped, but it's certainly easier to root for Jason than Freddy. Enough of the formula analysis though, and the Jason sympathy train. Let's get on to the main reason I like this movie. It is just so freaking fun to watch. The spectacle in this movie far surpasses any other Friday the 13th movie, as the crossover between these two characters makes for such an entertaining watch. Jason here is in prime form, and this is one of my favorite versions of Jason. While he looks a little bit different than I'm used to, I think the heightened physicality of this Jason is great in its own way. I love how powerful Jason is in this movie, as he's always just throwing people around as if they're nothing, including Freddy. I think his outfit is spot on, feeling classic yet fresh all at the same time. I also just love the I don't give a crap attitude that Jason exudes throughout this whole movie, that contrasts so nicely with the egomaniac that is Freddy Krueger, but he also displays fear really well when Freddy Krueger does eventually get under his skin. I think this Jason is totally awesome and I have nothing to complain about. Fred fighting Jason earns himself an A rank.
Ultimate victory.
Now, Jason is great, but his sparring partner is no slouch either. This is classic Freddy through and through, and it feels so accurate to his portrayal in his own movies. While I always thought about Jason Voorhees versus Michael Myers as the fight to make when I was a kid, I actually think Freddy is a way better opponent for Jason. For one, it'd be a really quiet movie if it was Jason versus Michael. What separates Freddy from those two is his charisma and personality, with Freddy feeling closer to the Green Goblin than any silent slasher. Freddy's smack talk to Jason kept their battles interesting, adding just the right amount of flavor without getting on my nerves. It's super entertaining to watch Freddy frustrated with Jason because of how hard it is to kill him, something Freddy is definitely not used to, but us as audience members are 100% aware of. The fight in Freddy's dream world is super awesome, and when the teenagers bring him into the real world and he sees Jason in the flesh, the fear on Freddy's face is just so hilarious. These two just make such an interesting match, and I could watch them battle it out every week. They're so much fun. I feel it's clear that I really like this movie, and I still have a lot of positives I could talk about. This movie is the most expensive looking Friday the 13th movie so far, with it actually feeling like it had a big budget for once. I also really like a lot of the side characters, as the main girl is pretty decent and the other characters are distinct enough that their interactions feel fun. My favorite side character is definitely this pothead though. He's so freaking funny and he gave me some of the best laughs in the entire film. The kills here are also great, as we not only have Jason racking up a body count, but also Freddy Krueger dishing out some damage as well. While there are plenty of logistical and critical complaints you can raise against this movie, I honestly just don't care because this movie clearly had a mission, and I'd say it completed it in nearly flawless fashion. I have a hard time seeing any fans of these two franchises not enjoying this movie. You get the best of Jason, best of Freddy, and a ton of tense, hilarious, and satisfying fight scenes that made me hoot and holler anytime these two monsters traded blows. I recommend this movie to anyone that remotely enjoys the genre, meaning that Freddy vs. Jason easily earns itself an A rank.
That was cool!
Well, folks, we finally made it to the last theatrically released Friday the 13th movie, Michael Bay's infamous reimagining of the series. I'm not sure what the consensus on this movie is, as while some people tout it as the best in the franchise, others say that it's filth, not worthy of the Friday the 13th legacy. What do I think, though? Well, I actually kind of like it a little bit, though it's not perfect. With that, let's get into Friday the 13th, 2009.
I'd say my main gripe with this movie is probably the tone, though I'd say I'm more mixed on it than this actually being a genuine problem with the movie. With every Friday the 13th movie I've reviewed so far, there's been an underlying sense of goofiness that taints every entry, with some being more silly than others. However, this movie has zero goofiness, meaning that the overall tone is very serious. On one hand, I really like the tonal shift, as it separates this movie from the rest of the pack. Out of all of these movies, this one is the most intense and is certainly the scariest. These characters, with one exception, feel very grounded in reality, so when they die in a brutal and realistic fashion, it's less fun and more disturbing, which someone could easily argue is a more appropriate reaction to the loss of human life. When making it to the end of the movie, I feel more like I survived rather than enjoying the fun ride, and that feeling is most definitely a departure from how I feel finishing any other movie in this franchise. Well, other maybe than Part 9, but that's because that movie sucks! In some ways, that means I'm more invested and always on the edge of my seat, but in other ways, I feel like I'm not watching a Friday the 13th movie, as campiness is something so fundamentally ingrained in this franchise's roots. The serious tone is certainly a double-edged sword, as while it makes this movie special and gives it its own unique flavor, it also takes away one of the most fundamental ingredients within Friday the 13th. These movies are fun. And without the fun, everything feels a little different. But once again, that's not all bad, and might even make series detractors gravitate more to this entry. Due to the serious tone, Jason has changed from a somewhat goofy killer into a terrifying murdering machine. Remake Jason is brutal and scary, and not even close to being the same guy that we all know and love. The physical presence of this Jason is more intense than any other version, making him many people's favorite. Now, I know I said this version of Jason feels completely different, but fundamentally, he's still Jason. He has the same backstory, and this movie expands on Jason's more human elements, and his outfit even starts out with the bag head before later getting the hockey mask. However, the intensity of this movie changes the vibe of Jason, as while in other movies I couldn't wait for him to show up, this was one of the first movies I was afraid of him showing up. I give this movie mad props for transforming Jason into this physical specimen, while also keeping him authentic to the franchise's roots. That being said, this version of Jason is just a little bit too intense for me. While I could see him easily being your favorite Jason, I prefer a Jason that's just a little bit more campy. Meaning that remake Jason earns himself a very respectable B rank, with potential to be an A rank one day in my eyes.
Too easy for me.
Now, beyond the tone, this movie sticks pretty close to the Friday the 13th formula. This movie feels like if someone took the best elements of the first three movies and threw them into a blender. The movie starts off with a great flashback that finally gives audience members a clear-cut view of what happened with Jason, which I thank the Elder Gods for that. This movie takes the route that Jason never drowned and was hiding out in Crystal Lake and watched his mom die trying to defend his honor. This leads to a cold open segment that is one of my favorite openings in the entire franchise, with a group of campers looking for some pot before ultimately meeting their demise to Baghead Jason. Or so we thought. While Jason did indeed kill everyone in brutal fashion, he ended up sparing one girl that looked particularly like his mother. This feels like a direct callback to Part 2, with the only difference being that Jason is pretending that this girl is the mother and not the other way around. Once again, I think this fleshes Jason out in a way that makes me feel sympathy for him, while at the same time being terrified of him. Meanwhile, this girl's brother is looking for her, and in the process runs into a group of horny teenagers that are visiting rich kid Trent's cabin home that is near Crystal Lake. Now, as previously stated, these characters feel more grounded, which is a good thing and a bad thing. On one hand, I want them to survive more and I don't want to see them get killed off. On the other hand, they are a lot more boring. However, rich kid Trent is the exception. Not because he's likable, I mean far from it, but because he is a douchebag. Bro's always complaining, cheats on his girlfriend, and runs away like a wuss when things get hard. When he dies, it makes for one of the only satisfying kills, and is the moment in this movie that feels the most like classic Friday the 13th. Other than that though, it's business as usual. Jason slowly kills people off while people try to escape him, with the teens at the end of the film believing they finally killed him off, only to be surprised by one last jump scare. Pretty standard stuff, but as I said, the tone makes it feel new and fresh for the franchise, while also making it more alienating to longtime fans. I actually don't have much more to say about this movie. I will say that this is the most expensive looking of all of the movies in the franchise, though the actual camera movement and editing leaves something to be desired, as Michael Bay loves to shake the camera and make a ton of cuts, which is personally a style that I don't really rock with as much. Overall, the mileage you're gonna get out of this movie depends on how much you like the tonal shift. If you like the more serious and grounded take on Friday the 13th franchise, this movie will probably be your favorite. If you come to this franchise looking for a fun and spooky time, parts 2, 4, and 6 are probably more your cup of tea. Where do I fall? Well, when I think of Friday the 13th, this is not the movie I think of. I have to be in a certain type of mood to watch this movie, and it's not something that I rewatch as much as earlier installments. That being said, it's not bad. In fact, I'd say it's rather good. While it has its shortcomings, I would say it's a competently made film that excels in bringing true horror to the franchise, and for that reason, I couldn't give the Friday the 13th remake anything lower than a B rank.
Too easy. Piece of cake.
Why does everyone keep doing that to me?
Whoa, calm down there, man. You make it so easy.
Fair. What are you doing here?
We're less than a quarter mile away from our neighborhood.
Oh. Wait, we can escape him. Let's go.
Whoa. Escape who?
Jason Voorhees.
Jason isn't real. What are you talking about? Oh, I stand corrected.
Run.
It's just a flesh wound. I'll catch up with you later.
We don't have to tell me twice. I could end the video right here. I've already reviewed all the theatrically released Friday the 13th movies. However, we still have 2 more movies to go. Never Hike Alone 1 and Never Hike Alone 2.
Now I want to make it clear that Never Hike Alone is not an officially released Friday the 13th movie. This is a fan film made by Womp Stomp Films. However, it's popular and well reviewed, so it deserves to make my review list. I'll try to avoid spoilers more than some of the other movies on this list because I feel it's more likely that you haven't seen this movie. The basic premise is that a hiking vlogger is recording his trek through the mountains, but seemingly finds a shortcut that takes him through Crystal Lake. There, he slowly discovers some dark secrets that took place, while also encountering a mysterious hockey mask wearing man that lurks the grounds. Like Jason Goes to Hell and Freddy vs. Jason, this movie is a complete departure from the usual formula, but that is expected being a fan film. While Friday the 13th is usually well known for having a large cast of characters, this movie more or less boils it down to Jason and the hiker. While that might make it seem like this movie would be pretty boring, Womp Stomp Films does other things to keep the audience engaged that doesn't just involve Jason killing people. More than any other Friday the 13th movie, Never Hike Alone relies on a lot of environmental world building to paint the picture as to what happened at Crystal Lake. Seeing an abandoned dining hall with dead animals or a farmhouse with broken down furniture can be just as tension filled as when we see Jason stalking someone in the background. The sets themselves tell the story, and the hiker does a great job of knowing when to drop exposition, when to just react, and when to not say anything. The main appeal here is the tension built through ambience, and if that's not your thing, Never Hike Alone probably isn't going to do anything special for you. As for this version of Jason, he's just okay. He's got a classic outfit and decent physicality, the mask is good, but there's just something that feels a little off. It doesn't feel quite like Jason, more like someone impersonating him. I don't know if it's due to the performance not coming out as good as I would have liked, or if it's because there's not that many people to kill, but there's something slightly off. However, there isn't anything glaringly wrong, so I'll give this Jason a C rank.
That wasn't so hard.
Other than that, this is pretty much it. A simple tale of a hiker who wandered onto the wrong campground. I do have little gripes I could point out, as the fan-made isms are certainly prevalent. The music stands out, not in a natural way, and the acting at times leaves something to be desired, but keep in mind, this is a fan film, and a really good one at that. The creators clearly had a lot of passion for the source material, working in lots of clever Easter eggs and references for longtime fans to appreciate, including a really awesome cameo near the end of the movie. As previously mentioned, the environmental world building is super solid and gives a fresh spin on the Friday the 13th franchise. While I'd like to give it a B rank, I feel that there are just a couple things holding it back, mostly those aforementioned fan-made isms, but also the fact that this isn't at all what I'm looking for when I'm watching a Friday the 13th movie, as there is very little humor and campiness in very few people getting killed. While I think repeat watches could definitely improve this movie's grade for me, as it is very unique for the franchise, for now, I'm just going to give it a C rank.
Just made it.
Well guys, it took us a while, but we finally got to the last movie on my list, Never Hike Alone 2. Like the first one, this is a fan project developed by Womp Stomp Films. Now, originally, I wanted to get this marathon review out on Friday the 13th, but unfortunately this video took way longer than I thought. The silver lining though is that on that Friday the 13th I wanted to release this video, Never Hike Alone 2 came out, and now I get to include it in the video. But let's not waste any more time and get into the last movie on my list, Never Hike Alone 2.
Now, this movie is a direct sequel to the first movie, with returning characters from that movie and the fan film they made, Never Hike in the Snow. However, the biggest difference between this movie and the first one is that it isn't about hiking at all. It actually feels like a Friday the 13th movie. To recap, I thought the atmospheric world building and tension was the best part of the first fan film. That vibe has been ditched almost entirely for the more traditional thrills that one would expect from the franchise. Unfortunately, before I gush about this movie, I feel the need to get a couple of complaints out of the way. The worst part about the first movie was the aforementioned fan-madeism, which I actually think are worse here in the sequel. Because Never Hike Alone was so simple, a lot of the effects and subpar acting was hidden away, only popping up occasionally to remind that I was indeed watching a fan film. As I said, Never Hike Alone 2 is trying very hard to be a traditional Friday the 13th movie, and while that certainly makes it more interesting to me, it also makes it much more ambitious, and I am much more frequently reminded that Womp Stomp Films bit off a little more than they could chew. While some kills actually look awesome, others are, well, not good. While the acting is a cut above what I was expecting, there are some performances that just feel off. While there are shots and camera movements in the movie that have true cinematic quality to them, other shots and angles take me back to the good old days of home video. The music in the movie just way overdoes it. It feels as if every scene has the score blaring at all times, when environmental and atmospheric sounds would have been much more appropriate and professional. When the action is heavy, the music is fine, great even. But when two people are having a personal conversation, I don't need the score to keep saying hi. To be fair, the entire franchise suffers from overbearing loud music. I just found it especially apparent here. I hate nitpicking this movie because it's a fan film made by passionate creators that truly love the source material, and is better than any fan film I could have done. But there were a ton of these little distractions that would have had me scratching my head if this was a theatrically released film, which is why I feel the need to mention them. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get into everything that I adore about this sequel. The only reason I decided to watch this movie is because I saw Tom Matthews' Tommy Jarvis was on the freaking thumbnail, as if to say,
Oh yeah! This is happening!
I went in blind, no opinions to taint my own, not even a little. What I was left with was one of the most satisfying Friday the 13th movies I've ever had the pleasure of watching. I am happy to say that Tommy Jarvis being on the cover isn't clickbait like with Jason Takes Manhattan, as he is the main character. The first scene of this movie reestablishes his feelings towards Jason, giving us a really good look at his psyche and what he's been going through these past 30 years or so. This opening scene is filled with so many little references and callbacks to past installments that it actually made me feel like it truly belonged among the canon of the franchise. Tommy is also such a great character, as he is so likable and caring, while also kind of being an a-hole at times. He's just really fun to watch and makes for a great protagonist, which is aided by Tom Matthews' incredible performance, as he showed up to work like his career depended on this. Tommy returning also feels appropriate, as this movie more or less follows the structure of Friday the 13th Part 6 in particular, while sprinkling in a little bit of that 2009 remake. Once again, there is a sheriff that doesn't believe Tommy and thinks he's pretending to be Jason, while a woman named Diana actually starts to believe Tommy. Diana is a character that I was initially a little turned off by, as I thought her line delivery was a little annoying, but she grew on me by the end. Another thing that really helped me like her more was watching Never Hike in the Snow after this movie. Quick side note, I recommend you watch Never Hike in the Snow while you're at it, as I actually enjoyed it more than the first movie, despite only being 30 minutes. But back to Never Hike Alone 2, one thing it did nail was the tone. As you may remember, while I really liked Part 6, I prefer Part 4 because it's a little more serious. And while I really liked the remake, I thought it was just way too serious and not fun. However, Never Hike Alone 2 gets the goof to tension ratio just right. We once again have goofy side characters that are complemented by some more serious ones. While people seem to care about their lives more than they did in Jason X, it's not obnoxious like it has been in the past at times. This movie is also pretty funny, with tons of little gags and jokes that feel very at home with the Friday the 13th franchise, unlike the humor in the new Halloween trilogy that feels AI generated at times. The kills are also fun again, sometimes for the wrong reasons, while also having that sinister edge that came with the remake. That darker edge is mostly brought by our favorite hockey mask wearing killer. Making his return, of course, is Jason, and I don't know exactly what changed, but this is a great version of the character. He has great physicality and brings a ton of presence to the role like others before him, while also putting his own spin on things. Here, Jason is established as being extremely territorial and won't really leave Crystal Lake unless poked or prodded. I'd also say this Jason seems to be smarter than other versions, as he dismantles cars and actually makes tactical battle decisions to get a kill confirmed. Now, to be clear, he's still a big idiot, but I felt that he displayed slightly more intelligence than he usually does. And honestly, I'm totally cool with that. I like his outfit here, as it changes a little throughout the film, and I like how versatile he is with his weapons. He feels very much like a hybrid between the remake Jason and classic Jason, and I don't have any complaints with that. That being said, some of his movements still feel a little awkward at times, which may be due to the poor choreography of certain action scenes and goofier looking kills. But I'd say this is a solid improvement over the one from the first movie. I'm giving Hiker 2 Jason a B rank.
Too easy for me.
Back to the fan film though. The thing I love about it the most by far is how it is the ultimate love letter to Friday the 13th fans. As someone who just sat through 14 movies, it's so refreshing to see the creators pay so much respect to the source material. I like how this movie tackles the lore of the franchise, as while it doesn't definitively try to explain exactly what happened with Jason and why he's still alive, it attempts to give some explanation for things that doesn't feel out of left field. The conclusion Tommy Jarvis comes to in the movie makes sense, as unlike the bounty hunter in Part 9, it makes sense that he'd be somewhat of a lore master on Jason Voorhees. The movie also has so many little references to franchise history without feeling forced or out of place like they do in a lot of these 80s revival projects. Not only did they give little winks and nods at all the movies, but even had things straight out of the Friday the 13th video game. The climax in particular has so many little remember berries that just gave me warm fuzzies on the inside, while once again not ever feeling intrusive. The resolution to the conflict is super satisfying and had me waiting on bated breath up until the very end. All in all, this is a great Friday the 13th film. The praise that Never Hike Alone 1 usually gets is the praise I feel towards Never Hike Alone 2. It's got a ton of fun characters, plenty of tension-filled scares, and pays massive respect to the franchise's roots. Tom Matthew brings his A game as Tommy Jarvis, making this feel like a true successor to Friday the 13th. Jason Voorhees here is also fun and fresh, always keeping me on my toes and having me check my closet late at night. I don't know if or when we're going to get another Friday the 13th movie, but if this is the last one, then I'm happy to say that this is not only a great conclusion for Tommy Jarvis, Not only a great conclusion for Jason Voorhees, but a satisfying final chapter for the entire Friday the 13th franchise. While there are some shortcomings due to the fan-made-isms, I'm gonna pretend they don't exist because this is my video and I can do whatever the frick I want, meaning that Never Hike Alone 2 earns itself an A rank.
That was cool!
Now, before I give my closing thoughts, let's calculate all of the rankings and see where everything landed.
I hope after watching this video it is clear to all of you that I am a big fan of the Friday the 13th franchise. While the quality of these movies certainly leave things to be desired at times, I had a blast watching all of these movies, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but even Jason Goes to Hell was entertaining the first time. I couldn't tell you exactly why I enjoy these movies so much, but there's just something special about this franchise to me. It's crazy how what I've found to be such a mid-first movie led to 11 sequels and 2 fan films, with a passionate fan base that remains till this day. I think the lore and classic horror vibe of this franchise is what makes it so appealing even now. Jason Voorhees is this living legend that never seems to die, tied to Crystal Lake for the rest of eternity. When I talk about Jason Voorhees with anyone, I feel like one of the side characters in these movies that speak about the legend of Jason that everyone seems to know, but no one seems to believe. The whole series feels like a saga of spooky stories that you might laugh at by the campfire, only to find yourself a little bit nervous when going to sleep for the night, which is actually the way I tend to look at this franchise. We're getting into some headcanon territory here, so be warned, but I see these movies as disconnected legendary campfire stories that people are telling that sometimes continue, but not all the time. The story started out with the legend of Pamela Voorhees, only to be followed by her son Jason Voorhees, with each individual legend being told in a different way. Kind of my workaround for some of the continuity errors and the fact that Jason looks so different in each entry. According to my headcanon, these are individual interpretations. It's why sometimes Jason drowned and came back and other times he never drowned at all. Sometimes he's an evil parasite brought to life by the Necronomicon from Evil Dead, and other times he ends up in space. All these movies remind me of these goofy stories my friends and I would tell around a campfire when I was a Boy Scout, with each story just getting crazier and more convoluted as we went on. It's true that these movies aren't masterclasses in cinema excellence, but they were never trying or pretending to be that in the first place. They are just fun, dumb campfire stories about the legend of Jason Voorhees that make you laugh just as much as they make you scream. There's nothing ostentatious here, and in that sense there's this weird purity to the series that I haven't felt elsewhere. While it isn't as well directed as Nightmare on Elm Street, written as cleverly as Scream, or invoke chills in the same way that Michael Myers does in the Halloween movies, I will always prefer Friday the 13th's campy cabin setting and the myths of Crystal Lake to the meta humor of Scream or the pretentious angst of Halloween.
While the Friday the 13th movies are full of ups and downs, it remains my favorite slasher franchise for the digestibility and fun factor. I find myself in the mood to watch these movies every time October rolls around or when I look at the calendar and I see that it's Friday the 13th. Thank you all so much for watching, and that's not fair! This is my basement! This is my house! If you guys somehow made it to the end of this behemoth of a video, thank you all so much for watching. If you guys like this video, please do me a favor, like and subscribe or comment. My favorite part at the end of these videos is reading your guys' opinions, and it means a whole lot to me when you guys take the time to do so. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you later.